Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We are going to take a look at our final topic in this video today, personal identity. So in this video, we're just going to talk about how it comes up in the two films, Chappie and Moon. Put out a few ideas, just sort of in rough form, about what those answers might look like or what the problems might look like. And then in the next couple of videos, the one tomorrow, Thursday, we're going to be taking a look at John Locke's approach to this, which I'm going to mention briefly, at least sort of what the outline of that approach is. And then on the following Monday, our very last class, we're going to look at Derek Parfait's more recent work on personal identity, which has been very influential and really applies in an interesting sort of way to Moon. So let's go ahead and take a peek here at what we've got going on in the two pieces. So this issue, personal identity, what we're going to look at here. There are lots of interesting questions concerning identity that can be raised. What different features of our identity are important, how different people might have different features in their identity that they consider important, how our identities might change through time, right, as you go through your life, and important events and so on, how that can affect you, and what sort of person you are, and right, there's a whole host of incredibly interesting questions concerning identity. And many different academic disciplines examine identity, human identity, animal identity, in different sorts of ways. Really, what we're going to be interested in here is this question about what makes us the same person through time. So what is it that makes me, Carl Latteroot, from the time that I'm born until the time that I die? What is it that makes you, you, right? And of course, again, we could take that question as really asking for, what's the most important thing about you? What's your essence? What is essential to who you are? What's your core self? Right, so some questions like that. And at least understood in some ways, something like what's the core self, or what's essential to identity? That does touch on our topic here. That would be a way of reframing our question. Also, what's most important for identity? That's a way to think of it too. What is it that makes someone the same person rather than a different person? And this sort of issue can come out in questions of changing personality, as well as issues of, say, memory loss, right? If I had some sort of accident, I had complete and total memory loss when I awakened or recovered, or however we want to frame that. I had no memory of who I used to be. I had no response to my name, right? Somebody said, "Well, you're Carl," and I said, "I don't think I am," right? That it'd be as if I told you're Carl Latteroot. You'd probably go, "No, I don't think so," right? Now, of course, you'd have some sense of who you were, but if I had complete and total memory loss, presumably I wouldn't have any sense of who I was, or where I came from, or who I was related to, or who I cared about. Dispositions could change, little things that I do, right? The sorts of behaviors I have. There are also questions about how bodily change might occur as well. So, all right, bring up a lot of different things. Let's start talking about Chappie here, and we've already talked about Chappie a little bit when I was talking about Chappie with the can machines think? Is Chappie really a thinking thing? The personal identity issue comes up in Chappie in a couple of ways. So, of course, we can ask whether or not Chappie himself is a person, right? And related to this are these questions about what is it that makes something really someone a person, right? What is it that makes some entity a subject rather than an object, right? The kind of thing that we regard as a person. Now, of course, even that term, well, what is a person, can be defined in different sorts of ways. Generally speaking, we think of a person as the sort of being that deserves, consideration in morality as well as law, certainly. And of course, property also is considered within law, right? And there are these questions of property rights and so on. But persons are the sorts of things who are the bearers of rights, right? Me being a person, I'm the kind of thing that has rights, say rights to life and property and so on. My phone or my laptop or my computer, it's just not the right kind of thing to itself have rights. If you came into my house and smashed up my computer, you couldn't be taken to court, by the computer's family or, the province or the federal government wouldn't take you to court for, beating up or killing a computer. You couldn't be put on trial for murder for killing a computer. Right? Now, if you came in and, bludgeoned me to death, well, you could be put on trial for that. Why? Because you violated my right to life. If you came in and destroyed my computer, I could take legal action against you for destroying my property. But it's only because it's mine and you have in some way injured me or my interests that you can be held legally liable here. When we're thinking about Chappie and whether or not Chappie's a person, there's a similar question. Is Chappie still just a piece of property, right, owned by the company? Or has he become something else? Has he become like, a human, a subject should be regarded as a thinking thing? This is really when we're talking about subjects. This is, subjects rather than objects. Objects don't think, they aren't self-aware, they don't have memories and so on. They are properly things, not who's, right? They aren't a people. They aren't considering reflective beings who make judgments and choices. Now, just on this note, of course, we can consider whether or not Chappie's a person. Just thinking a little bit more broadly, there are also interesting questions when we're considering, who or what counts as a person. What sorts of beings deserve consideration in ethics, in moral theorizing, thinking about what we should do and how we should treat other things, as well as what sorts of beings have rights that should be represented by, like within the law. There are very interesting questions about animal rights. Are at least some animals persons? We might think here of, let's just take dogs, right? Domestic dogs, pets. Are they persons to some degree? Is personhood something that comes in degrees, or is it sort of a binary? You either are a person or aren't a person. Dogs certainly don't seem to have the same sort of memories we do. They certainly have memory, but they don't do calculus. They don't communicate the way we do. They don't sort of talk the way we do. They don't seem to have all the same capabilities we do. But then again, neither do human babies. Right? We think human babies are persons that have rights, or at least most of us, at least to some extent, at least right, most of the time. So what is it that makes, say, human babies persons but not dogs? Right? Are dogs the sort of thing that should have their own rights under the law, or are they properly considered pieces of property that only have rights insofar as their owners have them? And so here there are questions about cruelty to animals. Should there be laws against cruelty to animals? And if so, what form should those laws take? What is it exactly that's wrong with cruelty to animals? Is it that the animal has some kind of right that's being violated? And if they do, are they a person, at least to some degree, right? They've got some set of rights. Or do we define it some other sort of way, right? That cruelty to animals is wrong because of the sorts of intentions it exhibits from the persons, the humans that are actually doing it, right? We can ask further questions here. What about intelligent aliens? They be persons as well? And of course, if we're thinking about other sorts of creatures here on Earth, again, we can extend that domain. Well, okay, if we want to say dogs are to some degree, what about, armadillos or ants or butterflies, right? What about chickens and pigs and cows, right? What about the sorts of animals we eat and use their products, right? Not all of us, but many people. Is there something morally wrong with that should be reflected in law, right? Interesting questions. We're certainly not going to be able to answer all of them here, so we're going to have to narrow this down. So really, we're going to be focusing on this question: what is it that makes somebody a person? Certainly in the most relevant kind of sense. And one popular answer here that I've already been talking about really comes from John Locke, articulated in the 17th century. So I've given you reading on Locke from one chapter on an essay concerning human understanding. And in it, we're going to see Locke really make this case that what is it that makes something a person, what makes something a someone? Really, self-awareness. It's to be a thinking thing. It's to be a conscious entity. It's to be able to have the ability to regard oneself as the same thing through time, which of course relies on memory. So the reason I'm the same person now as I was when I was 10 is because I can remember at least some things that happened when I was 10, Locke would say, and identify what happened at that point as happening to me, as happening to an earlier version of myself. But there's a kind of identification, that I've got some kind of memory of what occurred, and that I can look back and say, hey, that happened to me. So if that's the way we want to go with personal identity, then thinking about Chappie, right? Whether or not Chappie really is a person rather than just an object, rather than sort of merely a machine, really is then going to depend in large part on our answers to the question about whether or not Chappie's really thinking. Right? If Locke's right that it's really self-awareness, self-consciousness, memory that matters, then we have to be able to say that Chappie, in fact, is a thinking thing, a self-aware thing, to be able to say that he really is a person through time. And this is exactly the sort of thing that we saw Vincent, or Hugh Jackman's character, trying to deny. Chappie isn't really real, right? When he says things and responds to his environment, and even makes claims like, I'm thinking, I'm self-aware, I'm frightened, I'm upset, I'm happy, or whatever. It's not really reflecting consciousness, right? It's just mimicking conscious behavior. Now, Dion is another very interesting character. In a lot of ways, I think we can focus our discussion of personal identity through time in Chappie really on the character of Dion, which is not to say that it's not very interesting to look at it in terms of Chappie, but Dion obviously seems to be a person, right? Because Dion is a human, right? And we tend to think that humans, right, at least certain humans, right, like minimally, adult humans with all of their, mental faculties about them and so on, are sort of the prototypical persons. That's generally what we take to be, just by default, a person. And then it's this question of, to what extent are other sorts of beings persons as well? Precisely what capacities or qualities of that sort of being, the adult human, what is it that makes them a person? And then to what extent do other sorts of beings or entities, objects, things, have those qualities and thus are persons as well? So now, of course, we could make the argument that Dion really isn't a person. I'm not sure on what grounds we would make that. Maybe we could make some sort of argument that not even humans are persons, nothing's a person. That, maybe, right? That's really beyond the scope of what we want to investigate here. So let's just assume Dion is a person, at least when he's a human. Right? Dion also seems to be the same person through the film, at least up to the point where he has his consciousness transferred by Chappie into a robot body. Now, here's the interesting question. Is Dion really the same person after his consciousness is transferred to the robot? Now, here again, there's that question about whether or not robots and machines can think that we were talking about when we were thinking about, is Chappie a person? If robots can't think, then after Dion's consciousness is transferred, then it seems like our answer needs to be no. What we have is a robot who's mimicking Dion's conscious activity and is thus mimicking what Dion would do if he were still alive. But given that Dion's body is dead, right? The robot looks over and there's dead Dion with the helmet on and everything. If machines can't think, then once Dion's biological body is dead, then that's just dead, right? The robot can't be the same person because the robot isn't a person. But if the robot can actually think, if Dion's consciousness is transferred over like that, then there's this question: is that robot the same person as Dion, right? Numerically the same. Of course, there are qualitative differences, right? Differences in the quality. Robot Dion is a robot. He's not a biological human anymore. That's a pretty significant difference. There's also sort of a spatiotemporal issue, right? So there's physical Dion there, and then he has the helmet on, and it gets linked up, and it gets sent into the robot, and his consciousness is sort of transferred through the wires. So there's that, right? We could sort of trace this line and say, ah, okay, and then we, from Dion's biological body, we sort of go through the wires and wind up in the robot, and the consciousness transfers that way, and then right, as a robot, he moves around. We can sort of trace this line through space and time. It goes back to Dion. There's an interesting question I didn't stick here on the slide with Yolandi. So Chappie makes a copy of her consciousness, backs it up on like a little flash drive or something, which is kind of funny, and then he sends it over the internet. So it winds up, we sort of see it goes through like a satellite dish. So it's digitally transferred through waves in space. So there's not that sort of physical connection. There is in some sense, because of course waves are real. But it's not like, we go from Yolandi and her consciousness through the wire to the object, and the object goes, straight into inserting the consciousness in a new body. Instead, this time it gets sort of transferred up through the ether, right? The internet, whatever that is, sort of all around us. So there's, an interesting question there. Is there some kind of relevant difference, going on with Yolandi being inserted into a new body that's different from Dion, given that the physical dimension of the whole thing is somehow different? In some sense, Yolandi's consciousness is teleported from one place to another. Right? All the information's in one place. It gets sent up, through the Wi-Fi kind of, right? Wireless connection, and then gets instantiated again somewhere else. Maybe that poses an interesting, relevant difference. Maybe not. Just coming back to Dion. If we think that he is the same person after his consciousness is transferred, literally that robot is now Dion. Right? It's one and the same person. Dion in his biological body, Dion now in the robot body. We might think that, right? Because the robot presumably has all of the same memories that original Dion had, identifies as the original Dion, and so on. There isn't another Dion running around. The biological Dion is dead, so it's not like we've got a competition here where there's two different competing candidates saying, I'm the real Dion. But what if, when Chappie uploaded Dion into the robot body, he actually uploaded him into two, right? And then there were two robots that sort of woke up and identified themselves as Dion, had all of Dion's memories, right? We could trace a spatiotemporal link from the original biological Dion through two sets of wires to do two different robot bodies. What would we say then? Are they both really Dion? Is only one of them really Dion, right? Is the real Dion dead? Right? Only the biological Dion was the real Dion. Now we've got two copies of Dion. Now that's an interesting question, right? And that's one that Locke's theory that personal identity, who you are, and what makes you the same person through time is really set by our self-awareness and our memories. Locke's theory doesn't seem able to handle that very well. And it's precisely this kind of tricky case that we don't actually see in Chappie, right? Chappie keeps it fairly simple. It's sort of just one-to-one, right? Dion goes from biological body to robot. Chappie goes from one robot body to another. Yolandi goes from one biological body to one robot body. But our last film, Moon, does deal with this last issue, multiple cells directly. So again, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it and you don't want any spoilers, go watch the film before watching the rest of this video. So we get Sam Bell, played by Sam Rockwell, who's an astronaut. He's the space miner on the moon. Right? This is the setup for the film. He's up there for this 3-year stint. He's got this contract where he has to stay up there for 3 years, looking after the harvesters, sending ore back to Earth, and then he gets to go home, and the communications have been severed somehow, so he can't have a live chat with his wife and his daughter. So instead, he gets these sort of delayed video messages that he gets to send via the Jupiter link. Well, he's only got a couple of weeks left, and then he gets to go back to Earth, and he's very excited about it. But before that happens, there's an accident. Right? He then wakes up in the infirmary. Well, and then after he wakes up, he's supposed to stay inside, but he goes out, discovers the crash site, and he discovers that there's two of them. Right? So there was him that was in the crash, and then he woke up in the infirmary. and then he went and discovered himself. Right? He found out that Sam Bell was in the accident and Sam Bell woke up in the infirmary, but they're not the same person in some sense, because they're different, right? They're in different places, right? They don't occupy exactly the same physical space, right? One's out in the crash site, one's in the infirmary, right? Once they're both in the base, right? One of them is in this side of the room, the other one's in that side of the room. So they aren't exactly the same insofar as they occupy different spaces at different times, right? They're two different physical things. As the film progresses, especially, we see that there are differences in their sort of physical health, right, that become more and more pronounced. I'll just sort of leave that, you can fill that in. Now, ultimately what we get in the film is that we see these two clones of Sam Bell interacting with each other on the moon in the base. We find out that the original Sam Bell is back on Earth, or at least we're led to believe the original Sam Bell is back on Earth, right? Eventually what happens is a video call. And of course, both of the Sam Bells on the moon initially thought they were the real Sam Bell, in part because they have memory implants, we're told, by Gertie, the sort of robot assistant, who identifies them both as Sam Bell, right? When asked, right, well, who am I? Well, you're Sam Bell. Well, and who's he? Well, he's Sam Bell, right? You're both Sam Bell, right? But how's that possible? Can't there only be one Sam Bell, right? This is the issue that's really brought to a head. So what we see are these clones of Sam Bell, and we find out there are many, many more, right? There's not just two, there are all sorts of them. When they wake up, right, when they're sort of activated for the first time, they go to the infirmary. Gertie runs this program, and right near the end, there's this interesting little exchange where Gertie says, oh, the new Sam and I will be back to our program, in no time. And Sam reacts, I'm a human. I don't run a program. And of course, this invokes some interesting questions, thinking back to Chappie and thinking about, can machines think? The functionalist, somebody like Putnam, would be quite happy to regard humans as, in some sense, running a program, right? We run a certain functional program. We have certain input-output functions. Given a certain kind of situation, we can determine probabilistically what's going to happen, right? We're not different in kind in any particular special way from other sorts of machines. Of course, Searle thinks there's a real problem in that. Sure, we can think of humans as machines, biological machines of a certain sort, but we are different and special insofar as we're conscious in a way that machines can't be. So do we run a program? Well, sort of, insofar as we follow a set of rules, but we aren't programmed in the same way, Searle asserts, that robots are. Robots are, machines or computers. There's a real question there. Are we not? Why aren't we? What's the difference? All right, now I'm just going to sort of shelve that and come back to this question about personal identity. And of course, there are whole questions here about cloning ethics as well. If we had more time in the course, we could do a little unit on that. Assuming we have the technology to produce clones, should we produce clones of humans or not? Interesting question, but another issue that we're going to shelve for the sake of focusing on this personal identity topic. So we've got these, minimally, these two self-aware clones of Sam Bell, who both, when they wake up, believe they're Sam Bell. They have what they regard as memories of being Sam Bell, right? Memories of interacting with, like being on Earth and interacting with Tess, right, his wife on Earth, and seeing Eve, the child who was born. It certainly seems like after, he goes to the moon. So there are these interesting questions, right? Who are those clones? Are they actually Sam Bell? Could there be three Sam Bells walking around at the same time in different spaces and different times, different physiological conditions? One Sam is sick, the other one is healthy. One has sort of cooled off his temper, he's patient. The other one is sort of hot-headed, right, and lacks patience. Is that possible? If they aren't the same person, because, if we say, look, you can't have three of the same person walking around in different places with different qualities being ascribed to them, right? Well, then, what is it that makes someone a person, right? If we say they're different people, When did that happen? When did they start being different people? To what extent are they the same person? Right? Especially when we start looking at this question of memory. Well, they share a bunch of the same memories. If we take Locke's theory and apply it here, you're the same person if you can remember something and self-identify as being that person. Well, the clones, at least before they become aware that they're clones and become aware that the memories aren't really theirs, seem to really be Sam Bell at the same time that there's another real Sam Bell down on Earth. Right? Do they only lose that self-identification after they become aware that they're clones and that the memories aren't real or not really theirs in some sense? This is where Parfait's theory comes in. Parfait really complicates the notion of personal identity. And I'll give you sort of a bit of a warning. In some ways, if Locke seems to present us an answer and a theory to, what is it that makes somebody the same person through time, that seems pretty straightforward and sensible and it's sort of easy to grab onto. The way Parfait approaches it and the questions he raises and the answers he gives make that ground seem to sort of come loose under the feet, right? You can get a bit of a sense of disorientation, which I think Moon does nicely at mimicking. We're pretty confident we're us, right? I'm quite confident I'm really Carl Lattery. I've never seen another one of me wandering around anywhere, right? I have no reason to believe I'm a clone or a copy or anything like that. But what if it's possible to do the sorts of things happening in Moon? Make a clone of somebody and plant memories into them. Have more than one version of the same person walk around at the same time, right? Say 2 versions of Dion or something like that. What if Dion's consciousness was just copied? So there's a biological Dion still walking around, right? They took him to the hospital and actually, solved the bullet wound situation. But then there's also robot Dion wandering around. Would that be different from, say, in Moon, right? It's not a machine issue now. We've got 2 biological Sam Bells, and they've got the same, or basically the same, DNA, same physical appearance and so on, but they're in different places, right? Different physical places, but they've got the same memories, at least to some extent. Okay, I'll go ahead and just wrap this up here. That should give us a sense of what we're getting into and what we're going to be looking at in the next couple of days. Until then, stay well, and I'll be back tomorrow talking about Locke's theory of personal identity. See you then.